Okay, sorry about the wait on this PowerPoint, guys. The first one that I did, it kind of married two of my recordings together, and it just took me a while to have the time to redo it. So with this PowerPoint, there's not a ton that you guys are going to have to know to take into the exam. So we'll go through it hopefully really quickly. There's the gas analyzers that we're going to be looking at are what are called electrochemical. There's two types that we're going to be focusing on, the galvanic cell and the polarographic. And we'll kind of talk about the differences between those in just a little bit here. The only thing on this slide that I actually want you guys to know is the hemoximetry or the co-oximetry, understanding that those are the two analyses that we would do to look at hemoglobin, carboxyhemoglobin, and methemoglobin. This definitely is a more common measurement that you would use, particularly in the emergency room. So I think if you throw this guy on a flashcard, it will serve you well. These ones, not so much. For pulmonary function testing or just in general, if you go over in the lab, they do use nitrogen and helium to perform some of their tests. So there's like a nitrogen washout that they do that gives them information about residual volume, and a helium dilution that they do that gives them information about residual volume. I personally am not going to test you on anything related to the pulmonary function tests. It's just another place that we use gas analyzers or just utilize different therapeutic gases that we've talked about before. So for electrochemical oxygen analyzers, they usually should be accurate within 1 to 2%. The big takeaway, and the board likes to ask different questions associated with this, is that they actually measure the pressure of oxygen and then they display the FiO2. Okay, so if you're measuring the pressure of oxygen and then utilizing that to display the FiO2, if you have barometric pressures, that's going to potentially alter the accuracy of your O2 analyzer. Okay, so if you're thinking about where this comes into play a lot, if you're thinking about somebody who's on an air transport, and let's say they're on an airplane, and the altitude is very, very high because they're high up in the air. And we know that when you get very, very high up, that lowers your partial pressure of oxygen. So if it's measuring the partial pressure of oxygen, there's the potential that it could read falsely low because your equipment would still be delivering, let's say, 60% FiO2, but your actual analyzer is measuring the partial pressure of oxygen. So this allows for some potential errors in that way. These are pretty low frequency events, but it's definitely something that the board wants you to understand and something that you would be examined on. So again, the two types of electrochemical analyzers that we're talking about are the polarographic, which this one tends to be referred to as the Clark electrode, and then the galvanic fuel cell, which is what we're going to end up probably having hands-on in lab with. So for the polarographic or the Clark electrode, just really the big takeaways that I want you to know from this slide is that the Clark electrode is what measures PO2. So that should go on a flashcard. This, you guys do not have to know. This is just how this essentially works. You have a platinum cathode, which is positively charged, and a silver anode, which is negatively charged. And it measures basically the flow of O2 through oxygen molecules through a membrane, all kinds of stuff that you don't really need to know. Just really the Clark electrode measures PO2. There is a battery that will speed up the process that you kind of have to know in the sense that later on we're going to talk about how to troubleshoot O2 analyzers that aren't working, which hopefully will come in handy for the O2 analyzers that are not working in our lab currently. The Clark electrode is also used in ABG analyzers and transcutaneous monitors. So I would say Clark electrode measures PO2, the battery speeds up the process, and that the Clark electrode is used in ABG analyzers and transcutaneous monitors. That's it for this slide. That's all you're required to know. This is an example of the transcutaneous monitor, like internal workings. Again, probably not something that I needed to include. Look at me, my detail-oriented self. So this definitely should make it on a flashcard. Clark electrode measures PO2. Severinghaus electrode measures PCO2. This is a good board question and definitely comes up on an exam. So this should be on a flashcard. This is an example of a transcutaneous monitor in a way that you would see it, obviously not the inner workings. So what a transcutaneous monitor is it has a membrane associated with it that sticks onto, generally speaking, we use this with premature babies, it sticks onto the skin, and it has a warming mechanism on the membrane that will actually warm the skin to try to bring blood flow to the surface, and it will analyze the CO2, the SpO2, and then the heart rate. And this is something that we'll do for babies that are on high frequency ventilation to just track their PCO2 real time. So I hope you guys get a chance to see these in clinicals. They do not get used very often, but they're definitely an important tool when they are used. This is the other version of the electrochemical analyzers. This is your galvanic fuel cells, and there's a lot of different versions of this. So this is the one that we have in lab that was giving me quite the difficulty. These are some versions that we have at Gunderson. So for lab, I'm going to get some of those in there that hopefully work, and you guys can see how they work to analyze different oxygen levels. Again, I don't know why I included this, to be honest, because it's not something I'm going to make you memorize. For this one, the battery doesn't speed it up. The battery just works as the display. So it just displays the numbers. With a galvanic fuel cell, it's kind of, if you're looking at it from a perspective of on and off, it's kind of always on, which is why they tend to exhaust themselves, because the fuel cell will constantly be creating this reaction. And so your battery could be turned off, so the display could be off, but that galvanic cell is always kind of running. So that's why they can be difficult to keep working, because you can't really turn them off. So big thing that we're going to be doing in lab is, if you're using an oxygen analyzer, you need to do what's called a 2-point calibration. So you would expose the analyzer to room air, make sure that you can calibrate it to 21%, and you can actually wiggle the dial till it says 21%. Then you're going to expose it to 100% FiO2 and calibrate it to 100%, okay? After you do that, you expose it back to room air again, and it should on its own be able to return to the 21% without you having to tweak anything. If you have a failure to calibrate or something goes wrong, there's different ways that you can troubleshoot this. A lot of the time, it is this sensor depletion, and that goes back to the fact that because it has this galvanic fuel cell in it that's always creating this kind of chain reaction where it's measuring the oxygen, they will get depleted and stop working, which is what happened to ours. You could also have a low battery, which would be affecting your display, but the battery on at least the galvanic fuel cells really doesn't have anything to do with the analyzing itself. It just has to do with the ability for the device to display the numbers. So those are kind of like your troubleshooting points. For us, I think what has happened is that we have sensor depletion, which is strange because we should still have about a month left on them based on when we bought them. But I don't know. So again, failure to calibrate or inconsistent readings. It could be weak or low battery, sensor depletion, a loose cable so you can check your connections. And then this could be, if you've done all that, it could just be an internal electrical failure, in which case we have to contact people much smarter than me, which is almost everybody. But you contact biomedical engineering, and you would more than likely either have them fix it or get you a new one. Some of the other things that can cause false readings. So let's say your FiO2 analyzer is working, you're not having an issue with the galvanic fuel cell, you're not having an issue with the battery. Water vapor, very commonly, is an issue for both our CO2 and our oxygen analyzers. Having water vapor in the lines, having water vapor on the sensor can make for kind of wonky readings or just make it air out. So if we ever have it in line with like a blender, which often we do, particularly in the neonatal community, we always analyze all of our oxygen all the time. You want to make sure that you have it pointing up so that the water vapor isn't collecting into it. And then just be aware of where it is in the line so that it's hopefully on, they call it like the dry side or the wet side, but you want it on the dry side. So you want it before the line gets to your humidifier so that hopefully you're not having that issue. The other thing too is we talked about how because it measures PO2 but displays FiO2, if you have a lower pressure, like when you're on air transports, that could read a falsely low FiO2. I couldn't honestly think of an example of higher pressure. I mean, I guess when you think about if you were in a hyperbaric chamber, but if you had a higher pressure of PaO2, you would have a falsely high FiO2. So there's that. Big takeaway on the summary page, you guys really, truly, there's not a ton in this PowerPoint that you have to know. You're going to want to know the two kind of electrochemical analyzers that we're looking at. So you have your polographic one, and this is going to be your Clark and Severing-House electrode. Your Clark electrode measures your PO2. Your Severing-House electrode measures your CO2. Those are going to be located in your blood gas analyzers and your transcutaneous monitors. The next thing that you have that you guys are actually going to have hands-on with is your galvanic fuel cell. That's the one that's kind of always on. That fuel cell is always creating that electrochemical reaction. So they can deplete themselves and that can cause problems. Both of these are going to measure the partial pressure of gas and then display the FiO2. So that's important to know. The TCM, again, just kind of going back to what we just said, the Clark electrode is for oxygen, Severing-House is for CO2. Most likely cause of failure. This one I include because on the boards, they almost always ask a troubleshooting question for like different equipment things. For FiO2, for gas analyzers in general, the most likely cause of failure is always sensor depletion. So just kind of like chunk that away. Again, measuring PO2 and displaying FiO2, you need to do a 2-point calibration, starting at 21% and then going to 100%. You don't want it to be on the humidified side of the circuit, and you guys will kind of see what that means when we have our lab hands-on activities, and you guys get to set this up. And then hemoximetry is used to measure 4 types of hemoglobin. So reduced hemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin, carboxyhemoglobin, and methemoglobin. This one I do think is worthy of a flashcard. So that is it. That is the quick synopsis of this PowerPoint. I'm really sorry you guys had to wait for that. It's not all that impressive, but that is basically it for this lecture.